Picture the Ambassador Bridge connecting Detroit and Windsor right now. Thousands of heavy diesel trucks are gridlocked in the freezing cold. Billions of US dollars in American automotive parts, Midwestern agricultural exports, and raw steel are bleeding out by the hour. If you turn on your television, the political establishment is smiling. They are casually dismissing this catastrophic bottleneck as a standard, everyday trade dispute. They are lying directly to your face. Behind the heavy oak doors of Washington, the loud arrogance has completely evaporated. We are currently staring down the barrel of the most devastating continental trade rupture in over half a century. The architects of this economic chaos are secretly panicking, and the mainstream media refuses to show you why. To understand the lethal geopolitical trap the United States just blindly walked into, you have to rewind the clock to 1971. Richard Nixon sat in the Oval Office and deliberately unleashed a brutal financial shockwave specifically designed to crush the Canadian economy. He confidently waited for Ottawa to wave the white flag. He arrogantly assumed American financial supremacy was absolute, but history is unforgiving to overconfident empires. In the bitter end of that massive confrontation, it was the United States that ultimately folded. Today, that dark history is violently repeating itself. Tonight, we are stripping away the fake political theater. We are going to expose the secret phone calls, the panicked back-channel pleas, and the brilliantly executed legal trap that just humiliated Washington on the global stage. Now, here is the exact part of this unfolding crisis that should make absolutely every single American sit straight up in their chair. Over the course of the last 24 hours, the President of the United States did not step out onto a public stage. He did not send out an aggressive late-night tweet. He did not post some loud, chest-thumping message for his millions of followers on Truth Social. No, the Commander-in-Chief reached out quietly. He reached out directly to Mark Carney through the hidden shadows of back-channel diplomacy. And when a United States president, a man fundamentally defined by his massive public volume, starts moving his pieces in total silence, you must understand that that silence is absolutely not a sign of confidence. That silence is pure, unadulterated damage control. That is the distinct, undeniable sound of brutal internal economic numbers finally landing heavily on someone's desk and forcing them to realize that their aggressive public posture simply does not match their terrifying private reality anymore. Because here is the raw, dangerous truth that absolutely nobody in Washington wants to say out loud right now. There is a massive growing gap between exactly what the administration is aggressively telling the American public and exactly what the administration is desperately doing behind closed doors. And that specific gap just cracked wide open for the entire globe to witness. Stop and think about the core logic of this situation for a moment. If the White House truly, genuinely believed they had the nation of Canada completely cornered, why would they ever need to initiate a quiet, secret diplomatic outreach? Why would they not simply keep the massive pressure rolling forward? Why would they not keep the devastating tariffs climbing higher? Why would they not keep the loud, aggressive political theater going strong? The answer to that question is glaringly obvious. Somewhere deep inside the halls of Washington, someone finally ran the actual economic projections. Someone finally looked closely at the massive supply chain exposure. They looked at the devastating agricultural blowback. They looked at the severe manufacturing consequences. And they looked at the toxic political fallout waiting for them in absolutely key voting states. And looking at those brutal numbers, they abruptly realized this entire confrontation could rapidly spiral into something far more dangerous than just a few bad headlines and a couple of angry press conferences. And that is exactly when the secret phone call happened. This is absolutely not diplomacy as usual. This is a strategic pivot. This is a desperate signal flare. This is a controlled leak designed specifically to test whether the nation of Canada is willing to step back from the absolute edge of the cliff. And let me tell you something highly important. Governments simply do not execute moves like that unless the economic pressure they are feeling is incredibly real. The ultimate question is not whether the president reached out, but what exactly he asked for during that confidential call. What he requested behind those closed doors completely flips the mainstream narrative upside down. The media wants you to believe the administration is crushing Canada with tariffs like a glorious political victory parade. But the specific offer placed on the table tells the story of a man desperately looking for a ladder to climb down. He did not demand a total surrender from Ottawa. He did not demand a dramatic moment where Canada bends the knee. Instead, the White House asked for a partial rollback of the tariff violations that Canada has been calling illegal under the Cosmos framework. They asked for a partial rollback, not a full reversal. They wanted just enough to manufacture the superficial appearance of movement, letting the administration point at something and loudly proclaim they got results. That request is a massive, undeniable red flag. If Washington truly believed the Canadian economy was collapsing, they would demand full compliance and total submission. But the desperation peaked through even further. The administration explicitly asked Canada to merely pause its retaliatory tariffs while negotiations resumed. They did not demand a cancellation. They essentially pleaded for Canada to temporarily stop hitting back. That is not a posture of dominance. That is a frantic request for breathing room. Finally, Washington desperately wanted a joint public statement carefully framed as mutual de-escalation. They wanted empty diplomatic language where both sides pretend to be noble, purely so the administration could walk away without looking weak. You absolutely do not ask your opponent to help you save face when you are holding all the winning cards. You ask for that favor when you realize the battlefield is not going your way, and you need a political exit strategy before the casualties show up in the numbers. The president was not asking Canada for a legitimate trade deal. He was essentially begging Canada for permission to claim a fake political win. But here is the massive, devastating problem for the strategists in Washington. The Canadian government completely refused to play along with the political theater. Mark Carney looked at the partial offer and said no. And he did not just say no like an emotional politician throwing a public tantrum. He said no in a way that was incredibly calm, absolutely cold, and strategically lethal. Because the exact way he delivered his refusal was not just a simple rejection of terms, it was a meticulously crafted trap, and the administration absolutely did not see it coming. When most modern politicians are handed the rare opportunity to reject a United States president, they make sure they do it loud. They do it surrounded by a sea of microphones. They do it with massive national flags draped in the background. They host dramatic press conferences and deliver roaring patriotic speeches meant to rally their home crowd. They aggressively spike the football and throw gasoline on the political fire just to ensure the cameras catch every single second of the spectacle. Mark Carney completely refused to do any of that. He did not brag to the press. He did not posture for the cameras. He did not even use the specific word victory. Instead, he executed a maneuver that wins the ultimate long game. He responded exactly like a lawyer. He basically looked at the proposal and stated that they could negotiate, but the fundamental conditions had absolutely not changed. He demanded that Washington remove the illegal tariffs entirely. He demanded they withdraw the legally indefensible trade investigations completely. He demanded they fully restore the Cosmos framework that both sovereign countries had previously signed. And he stated they would only negotiate after that happens, strictly in that exact order. He explicitly rejected the concept of a mutual compromise. He rejected the offer to meet halfway. That exact phrasing is the strategic kill shot of this entire confrontation. Carney deliberately framed this conflict strictly as a legal dispute. And the moment you successfully do that, you change the entire battlefield. You absolutely do not fight a binding legal war utilizing blunt political muscle. You do not win a complex legal war by loudly pounding your fist on the table. You win a legal war by strictly utilizing treaties, rigorous documentation, and absolute legitimacy. Let us rigorously analyze the one entity that absolutely does not care about partisan politics. This entity does not care about grand political speeches. It does not care about massive political egos. And it definitely does not care about what the cable news networks desperately want you to believe. I am talking about the financial markets. Wall Street may be famous for being greedy, but Wall Street is absolutely not stupid. In this specific situation, Wall Street basically exposed the raw truth of the conflict in real time. The financial markets are acting as the ultimate lie detector test of modern geopolitics. They absolutely do not care who manages to look strong on television screens. They only care about who is actually absorbing the economic damage. The very second the news officially broke that the administration had secretly reached out to Mark Carney, the financial markets immediately moved up. Stocks rapidly climbed. Massive institutional investors finally started breathing again. You must ask yourself why. Those investors accurately interpreted that quiet outreach as a massive signal that this devastating trade war might finally be coming to an end. They absolutely did not see the outreach as Washington tightening the screws. They clearly saw it as Washington desperately searching for an exit door. If the markets genuinely believed Canada was in a position of weakness, they would have reacted in the exact opposite way. They would have assumed Canada was about to cave in and the United States was going to win a massive victory. But that is absolutely not what happened on the trading floors. The financial markets actively priced in American relief. They did not price in a Canadian collapse. And then, the moment it became glaringly clear to the world that Mark Carney had firmly rejected the partial offer, the markets immediately slid right back down. The brief wave of relief entirely disappeared. That highly specific market movement tells you something undeniably clear. Massive investors were actively rooting for Washington to end the fight. Not because they deeply love the nation of Canada, but strictly because they intimately know the American economy is heavily bleeding. Markets do not violently rebound on the idea that Canada is about to lose. Markets violently rebound on the idea that the United States is finally about to stop hurting itself. Now, we must examine exactly where this situation gets even more highly explosive for the current administration. While the general public is constantly distracted by the usual shallow political talking points on television, a massive mutiny is actively unfolding deep inside the president's own political party. In the critical 48 hours directly leading up to that secret diplomatic outreach, 3 prominent Republican senators hailing from vital agricultural and manufacturing states went on the public record actively calling for a negotiated resolution. They utilized very careful, highly measured political language, but their underlying message to the White House was absolutely unmistakable. You must deeply understand how the American political machine operates. Republican senators absolutely do not issue public statements demanding compromise unless their home districts are literally burning to the ground. They absolutely do not speak out publicly against their own leader unless their major financial donors are completely furious and their local industries are in a state of absolute panic. This internal mutiny happened strictly because the nation of Canada executed a masterclass in asymmetrical economic warfare. Canada did not just casually slap a few symbolic tariffs on maple syrup and arrogantly call it a day. They launched highly calculated surgical strikes. They meticulously targeted strategic sectors and massive industries exactly where the resulting political pain would be loud enough to violently shake the halls of Congress. They aimed directly at the specific voting blocs that the ruling party absolutely cannot afford to lose. American farmers, heavy manufacturers, and massive trucking companies are currently bleeding out from these retaliatory strikes. So, when the president finally picked up that phone to call Mark Carney, it absolutely was not because he suddenly woke up feeling highly diplomatic. It was not because he suddenly found religion and wanted peace. It happened strictly because the internal math permanently changed. The political cost-benefit calculation completely shifted against him. Secretly reaching out for an exit ramp simply became significantly cheaper than stubbornly staying on the destructive war path. While Washington was incredibly busy loudly pounding its chest and actively pretending this entire trade war was some kind of brilliant, unstoppable power play, the nation of Canada was executing something far more strategically profound. They were doing something highly quiet. They were doing something incredibly methodical. They were doing something that absolutely does not generate flashy mainstream television headlines, but unequivocally changes the entire balance of global power. Canada was meticulously building strategic escape routes. And I absolutely do not mean delivering hollow symbolic speeches about vaguely diversifying their international partnerships. I mean, they were executing real, massive infrastructure moves. They were securing real, highly lucrative trade missions. They were locking in massive energy deals and real commodity contracts. While the loud tariff war was dramatically escalating on the surface for the American public to watch, Ottawa was quietly, relentlessly reaching out across the globe. They aggressively deepened their vital energy relationships with European and Nordic partners. They massively expanded their commodity exports directly to Asian buyers. These are massive global markets currently desperate for highly stable supply chains that absolutely do not run through a politically unstable American trade relationship. That action is absolutely not political posturing. That action is rigorous, undeniable preparation. That is the nation of Canada actively dismantling the exact economic leverage that Washington arrogantly assumed it forever possessed over them. Because the entirety of the aggressive American strategy was built on one single, fundamentally flawed core belief. The political establishment blindly believed that Canada simply needs the American market far too much to ever successfully hold out. They arrogantly assumed that Canada would simply scream loudly for a few weeks, ultimately fold under the pressure, meekly accept some highly partial compromise, and finally pretend it was a fair deal for their citizens. Mark Carney looked directly at that arrogant assumption and completely shattered it. He declared that Canada is going to actively make itself significantly harder to strategically squeeze. This is the absolute death of the American dependency doctrine, executed with cold, rational precision. Despite all the intense economic pressure and the mounting financial losses, Mark Carney still looked directly at the American proposal and said no. This brings us to the most profound question that actually matters in this entire geopolitical analysis. Why would the Canadian government refuse a partial rollback of the crippling tariffs? Why would they deliberately refuse a diplomatic opening? Why would they not simply take the offered deal, shake hands for the cameras, and proudly call it progress for their bleeding economy? They refused because Mark Carney deeply understands a fundamental truth that the insulated political class in Washington almost always severely underestimates. This entire confrontation was never just about a temporary dispute over tariffs. This entire confrontation was about establishing a massive, permanent precedent. If you analyze this standoff through the cold lens of game theory, the strategic reality becomes terrifyingly clear. A mere partial rollback of severe trade violations is absolutely not a permanent solution. It is a highly dangerous blueprint. What? If Canada had accepted that half measure, they would have explicitly told absolutely every single future American administration that the established formula to successfully extort their northern neighbor is incredibly simple. The blueprint would dictate that Washington can simply break established international rules, aggressively impose massive economic pain, wait for the panic to set in, and then casually offer a highly partial fix while falsely framing it as a mutual compromise. That specific sequence is a deadly, inescapable trap that Canada would never escape from. If Ottawa folded today, they would be forced to endlessly repeat that exact same cycle of economic extortion. Mark Carney absolutely refused to help write that destructive script. He refused to legitimize a tactic of pure financial bullying. He made this calculation strictly because he is actively thinking exactly like a highly disciplined central banker and a meticulous lawyer. He is absolutely not acting like a desperate politician, endlessly chasing cheap applause from a crowd. Politicians inherently think in fleeting news cycles and upcoming election seasons. Financial architects think in decades, not in headlines. By willingly absorbing the short-term economic pain today, Canada is permanently immunizing itself against future blackmail. The current administration is now standing directly at a terrifying geopolitical crossroad. The president's next specific move is genuinely, entirely unclear. There are exactly two distinct paths standing directly in front of him, and absolutely both of them are incredibly risky. Path one dictates that Washington aggressively escalates the conflict. This means significantly more tariffs, significantly more aggressive trade investigations, and significantly more blunt pressure. The ultimate goal of that destructive path is simple: brutally punish Canada for refusing the offer and forcefully prove that Washington still unconditionally controls the situation. But if the administration ultimately chooses to take that highly aggressive path, the nation of Canada will absolutely retaliate at an even larger scale. The resulting economic damage will severely deepen, and both massive economies will absorb devastating, unforgiving hits costing billions of US dollars. Alternatively, if Washington takes the second path and completely backs down, the political establishment looks incredibly weak to its own voting base. It is the ultimate catch-22. And whichever path they desperately choose, we are rapidly moving directly towards something that absolutely nobody in Washington wants to talk about right now. That looming threat is the massive July 2026 Cosmos Review deadline. That specific deadline is absolutely not some abstract date casually marked on a calendar. That is the exact binding legal moment when both sovereign countries are strictly required to fundamentally revisit the entire trade agreement. By aggressively pushing this continental conflict to the absolute brink right now, Washington is essentially walking into the most critical trade negotiation of the century while simultaneously setting their own chair on fire. The legal trap has been flawlessly set, the political exit ramps have been aggressively closed off, and the entire globe is watching closely to see exactly who blinks next. The mainstream television networks will absolutely continue to sell you a sanitized illusion, but the brutal economic reality is finally knocking at the door. If you want to deeply understand the true mechanics of this global financial war, rather than the fake political theater, you need to subscribe right now. Share this vital transmission with anyone who needs to know exactly why their supply chains are violently breaking. The geopolitical board has fundamentally changed, and we will be here to decode every single move.